All right, hello. Am I coming in? Hello, Kimberly. Hey, Carrick. Came home from a jog about half an hour ago, so hopefully my allergies don't kill this recording. But we'll start the podcast proper in a few minutes. Just let people come in who want to listen in. I can update a few things in the meantime. So I've pretty much recorded all of Sekiro now. The only thing I want to do, and it's just going to be a lot of off-screen grinding, is getting the last of all the skills. And that's going to take quite a while to get up the experience points for that one. But that's hopefully coming either later this month or maybe in June. We'll probably focus a little more on it around the end of the month because that's when Yoshi's moving, so he won't be able to work on videos like for his own LPs, but he will be able to commentate at least. My day's been pretty good. Just checking a few things. All right, we're set, I think. Kind of an uneventful day so far, but I'll have plenty of work in the evening. Though amusingly, relating to the music, I woke up this morning, dreamed up a really darkly funny song that I'm hoping to record soon. It would be completely different from anything that we'll be talking about today. But I think we're about ready to get started here. So I'm going to go ahead and start recording. I will stop occasionally a couple times and offer you folks in the chat to ask questions or make comments that will be included in the recording. But let me set some things up onto the side. All right. You are listening to A Thorn in the Brain. I'm Austin, and we're resuming my retrospective on my music. If you missed the first half, it is up on my personal channel, ThornBrain, and you can download the MP3 of it and all other episodes from Mediafire. We left off with the release of my second album, Nobody Cares Unless You're Pretty or Dying, after which a failed attempt to start a band killed all my motivation to make more music. So for the next 5 years, I would occasionally think up a small idea, write it down, or quickly record it, and I'd amassed a large collection of pieces, but no full songs. I did re-release some of the unavailable music, as ThornBrain is really bad at this, since Sawtooth was putting out a similarly titled compilation around the same time, so we did that collaboratively. For a short period in late 2016, early 2017, Tiana Camacho and I had plans to do a collaborative album that never came to fruition. I'm not playing any of those ideas in case we follow through on it at some point. I recorded a couple small pieces that I uploaded to SoundCloud, one of which was the demo for Single Moving Star.
Shuttle in the air, here in a single moving star. Fly up from the east, here we head the other way. Do I know you on the inside? Maybe I will. Do I know you on the inside? Maybe I will.
And another was this hypnotic guitar idea recorded entirely with my Stratocaster, including as bass and percussion, that later became 4.206. But aside from those, my motivation wasn't there. At the start of 2018, it looked like I was done recording music and may never get back to it again. Then, something very specific happened. Lils Martin, aka Sawtooth, has their own podcast, Jukebox Zeros, with their friend Patrick S. Berry, where they talk about the notoriously worst albums of all time. One of their early episodes was for With Sympathy, the synth-pop debut album of Ministry, which they found to not really be that bad, and I agree. Sometime after, Lils asked for volunteers to take part in a tribute album to With Sympathy. I always liked doing covers, and I figured it would be a good excuse to finally record something again. I managed to snag the album's big single, Revenge, which I somewhat kept faithful, but played in a more guitar-led gothic rock style, more akin to Shadow of Love by The Damned. Doing that cover and stretching my recording and production muscles, trying out a lot of things I hadn't done with my last album, started giving me the inkling to record new music again. My big holdup had always been actually sitting down and starting recording, especially because I don't have a drummer, I don't have drum software, so I have to put each individual drum hit down on the project piece by piece. Doing Revenge made me realize that doesn't actually take that long, especially when I copy-paste it all anyway. I'd also always had trouble mixing the drums so they were audible. I had too much of a hang-up on I had too much of a hang-up on them not being too loud and compromising the dynamic range. But this helped me get over that, and it hasn't been a problem since. If I could, I would redo the vocals. I tried to make them sound hurt, frustrated, and intense, but at the expense of singing on key. Unfortunately, I lost all the recordings when my hard drive bricked shortly after. I think it came out okay, though. That was that was my version of Revenge on the Ministry with Sympathy tribute album Effigies. You can find it on Bandcamp at you can find it on Bandcamp at combustibledesigns.bandcamp.com, and any money you put towards it goes to support music education, so please do. Everyone had a really cool, unique take on each of the songs. It's a creative tribute. Originally, my track wasn't that warm and bassy, but I went back and ran it through a tape simulator on Sonar, boosted the bass, and then compressed the low end with a multi-band compressor. It ended up sounding really good. Adam Schneider from Big Time Kill said it sounded like it came right off an 80s cassette. Let me do it again. Adam Schneider from Big Time Kill said it sounded like it came right off an 80s cassette, which I'm totally down for. That ended up being my production goal for the next album. But before my motivation really came back, 2 albums came out. First, Mirror Might Steal Your Charm by The Garden. Then later, Patrick S. Berry from Jukebox Zeros put out the first album for his solo project, Smell, called Woof. I talked about both of those albums on the first episode of this podcast. Woof was my number 3 favorite album of 2018, and Mirror was my number 1, so I'm not going to go into them again here. The important thing is I found both of those albums very inspiring. They sound completely different from each other, but share a do anything, no limits attitude that finally motivated me to start recording new material in June 2018. The first song I started working on was Quero. Mastodon's last album, Emperor of Sand, gave me the idea of a man walking in the desert, falling over dead, and his skeleton ripping out of him and keeping on walking, perhaps forever. The original idea was something more mythical, or like a legend, than what it became. The title was originally Cairo, which isn't a real word, but something I thought up, inspired by Peter Murphy's song Huvola, which I couldn't find a meaning for anywhere. I did learn about the word quero, which is Latin for to seek, which gives the song an interesting angle it didn't originally have. The drums are inspired by Less Cities, More Moving People by The Fix, and it's the first song to use what I call the Casio phone, which is just my cheap toy Casio run through my stylophone as a distortion effect. So some things I did for this album that I hadn't before was I did a lot of work tapes and proofs of concept, not so much demos as they are simple examples of how a song is going to play out. I sent several songs, including Quero, to Tiana, who liked pretty much everything, but Jacob ended up being my de facto test ears for the whole album, pretty much without me asking him, but he was up for it. I picked him because we have overlapping music tastes, and he's one of my more readily available friends who are into music. But he can also be kind of a tough critic. He liked my last 2 albums but didn't love them, which is how I feel too. So I figured as long as Jacob likes these new songs, the album will turn out pretty well. Some of these proofs of concept and work tapes included vocal ideas.
The skeleton is waiting, your body is a carrying bag. for a skeleton waiting to be rotted out and freed. Left to die in the desert sun, his body fell and burned him dead. His skeleton tore through his skin, stood up, moved on, and thought in its head. The skeleton is waiting, your body is a carrying bag for a skeleton waiting to be rotted out and freed, only to be buried again and dissolve into the earth. The bugs and bacteria are waiting for their birth.
I did an extremely rough concept for Face Down Walls. Prepare yourself, it's very offbeat because I had to speed up and slow down the individual parts. I had a synth riff originally meant for tribute to a better song that also ultimately ended up in As Gods as Demons. And some very weird vocals that ultimately became Neuropia.
Did you hear that? Sounds like the thought of the skull of a skeleton being used as a footstool. Someone out there thinks he's multiple gods at once. All these have to let me in, let's kill them. All these have to let me in, let's kill them.
So all through June, I put down all these small ideas, and in July I had my first real work in progress sketch of Quero, which sounded like this.
The skeleton is waiting, your body is a carrying bag for a skeleton waiting to be rotted out and free. Left to die in the desert sun, his body fell and baked him dead. His skeleton tore through his skin, stood up, moved on, and thought in its head. The skeleton is waiting.
I literally tweaked that song until the day of mastering. I was never fully happy with it. I'm even still kind of not fully now, but at least it's like the centerpiece of the album. Here's the full version, finally.
Tore through his skin, stood up, moved on, and thought in its head. The skeleton is waiting, your body is a carrying bag for a skeleton waiting to be rotted out and free. The skeleton is just the first cemetery's once quiet.
Fun fact, that ghostly that's actually Dan Flintom's bass run through an effect back in 2010. I don't remember what effect that was or how to replicate it, but I'm glad I kept it. The intro noise percussion and garbled speech are also old Skype recordings I have from sometime in early 2010 when Skype glitched out and I could hear myself over Yoshi's end. He left the room to go do something, so I just sat there, turned on recording, and made mouth noises and banged my desk. I kept them in case I'd get some weird experimental use out of them, and I finally did with Quero. My plan with this new album was simply to record as much music as I could while I still had my creative kit going, then later I'd cut the weakest stuff and release the best as an album. A lot of it was built on top of all those small ideas I'd put down over the years, but never worked out into a full song. Some of them I had to force myself to complete or else I knew I never would. At some point, I began developing a loose story based on that guy and the skeleton from Quero as two separate consciences. The guy represents the old, the conservative, the oppressors of future generations, and the skeleton represents those future generations, millennials, Generation Zers, etc., and also queer and trans people stuck in the closet or publicly and politically oppressed and abused, waiting for the time they can finally be released and free. I didn't think it through super thoroughly, but it was enough of an idea that I was able to formulate a central theme for the album, which I ultimately decided would also be the album's and the characters' names, Buried Secrets and Old Lies. So let's do what we did with Nobody Cares and just go down the track listing. Since the album is fairly recently released, and many of you have already heard it, I won't play as many samples of the complete tracks. There's a video with 30 seconds from each song on TheStrawhatNO if you like, but I will play work tapes and proofs of concept to show my work process. First track, Here Comes Singularity Black. This is an old idea I had of a straight drone rock track with weird chanted vocals, meant more for how they sound than what they say. The title was originally Vanta Black, after the world's darkest black pigment, but it's a copyrighted name, so with some help from Silverhand in my Discord chat, I came up with a new title as a reference to a different black paint, and to the Killing Joke song, Here Comes the Singularity. The baby, quote-unquote, the character baby in the lyrics is a reference to my cat baby. It's also the first track to use my EBow, which I used mostly to make feedback and distorted noise by having the strings rub against it, and it's the first use of my Yamaha keyboard. Also kind of a cheap toy, but has some good sounds. So this is the proof of concept I originally sent to Jacob in August.
It's waiting outside, it's cold, be warm inside, it's beat to what I told you the night before. Platinum home, we find a gold in the life of the raw deal, just getting old. It's waiting outside, it's cold, be warm inside, it's beat to what I told you the night before. Platinum home, we find a gold in the life of the raw deal, just getting old.
The track does have an intro of Old Lies walking in the desert and falling over. The voice saying, "Don't be afraid, don't fear the new song," is meant to be buried secrets telling him that the future coming after him is not something to fear, but something to embrace, which a lot of conservative fear and fear-mongering comes from. This fear of something you don't understand, or a fear of obsolescence. It's actually a quote from Johnny Marr when he did a show in Sacramento, and I thought it was a cool line. The footsteps are just me putting my hand into my trash bin. It's just paper, really. It's clearly not sand, but now you definitely know it isn't. Hey, it's Dingo in the chat said, I really feel like the theme actually shined throughout the album. I appreciate it. I meant more like the story of the characters. I didn't think that part fully through. In the abstract, buried secrets and old lies, the themes, I think I got that for the most part. But I probably would have thought through the story more. Next, Abstract and Cracked. This was recorded around the midpoint of the album, and me pulling it off how I wanted was one of the big eureka moments, where I knew the rest of the album was going to work out. It's one of the songs most directly about the characters, Buried Secrets and Old Lies. It's fairly simple, but getting the riff, the leads, and the hooks right was very satisfying for me. This is the quite rough and vocally unpracticed proof of concept I sent to Jacob in August.
Abstract and cracked. Buried secrets and old lies, living in one mass, walking in lockstep. Buried secrets wants its own life, 'cause it means well, but can't do anything. Don't see him run, don't see him go. Abstract and cracked, don't see it all, they'll never know. Abstract and cracked.
That was another song I tweaked right up through mastering. I went through 2 or 3 different bass lines before finally settling on what I think was my second idea, inspired by the bass in Total Football by Parquet Courts. The problem was, aside from Quero, most of the album was recorded without my bass. I was under the impression that its input jack was busted and no longer produced a signal. I discovered late in recording that it was actually the cable I was using, so most of the album was recorded with my Stratocaster dropped an octave, which didn't work nearly as well. There's only a small handful of songs where I didn't replace it with the bass later in recording. Next track, Room for One More. After August, I took a couple of weeks off recording to focus on TheStrawhatNO and other things, and this is one of the songs I began after I resumed recording in September. It's a It's a Fugazi send-up, especially of their early EPs, and I lifted the drums pretty much directly from Inner Vision by System of a Down. I rediscovered them during recording. The title is a reference to the Twilight Zone episode 22, and I originally had a sample from the episode of Room for One More Honey and a scream, but I knew Viacom would go apeshit if I kept it, so I replaced it with me saying it. This is a piece of the instrumental version I sent Jacob, which still has that sample.
Room for one more, honey.
Next track is Cuero, which I've already talked about. Even though its story is kind of the end of the whole album story, I preferred to sequence the album based on the music and how it flows from each style, rather than try to follow a set timeline. Also, people like Cuero, so I put it earlier. It's followed by Face Down Walls, which was the second track ever recorded for the album, and it's followed by the third track ever recorded. That wasn't intentional, they just ended up working well in that order. Face Down Walls is actually based on a weird dream I had. I dreamed a version of this song that sounded more like What by Captain Sensible, which is an early funk rap novelty song. That's why the lyrics make no sense. So when I started working out the track for real, it turned into a dreamy dance rock track. And since I'm not averse to cannibalizing an old incomplete song, I reworked some of the lyrics from "An O in Hell" for it. It's also my first attempt at a guitar solo, unapologetically inspired by the guitar lick from Coldplay's Adventure of a Lifetime. I do like that song. I'm so unskilled, though, that I had to write and record the solo almost note by note. At most, measure by measure. I did that a lot recording the whole album, but especially so here. But I'm very happy with how it came out. The only thing I was never happy with was the cymbals. I don't think I ever got the mix on them quite right. I already played the proof of concept earlier, so let's just play a sample from the full song. I like this one. Next, The Mask is the Face. Like I mentioned, it was the third track ever recorded for the album, but it's also the first track that I fully completed. Almost every other song required additional tweaking in the following months, but this was done and dusted before September was over. It's an industrial punk rock track inspired by early Chrome, and it's about being an introvert hounded by extroverts to come out of your shell and show what you're really like under your mask, as if to say your introversion is not an actual part of your personality. I changed all the I's and U's to we and us, as a reference to Brian Eno's early solo work, where he found it more interesting to write songs about collectives of people instead of individuals. I reused one of the guitar licks from Face Down Walls before realizing I had, but I liked how it gave the album some kind of musical continuity. I also reused the E-bowed guitar feedback from Here Comes Singularity Black for the ending, since I thought it needed some noise to really be finished. Here's a piece from an instrumental work in progress I sent Jacob. It sounds so wrong without the effects, doesn't it? I did realize the riff is very similar to Clash City Rockers by The Clash. Oh well, I keep doing that accidentally. Next track is Angel Lungs, my attempt at a Melvins-ish sludge rock song that came out more generically blues rock than I'd hoped. It had one of the lowest dynamic ranges on the album, but I was able to loosen it up in mastering. It started as a purely surreal piece that during recording turned into a conduit for all my leftover post-breakup frustration, though very little actually has to do with the breakup. There's one line, 2 years and our worst fears had died, in reference to how long the relationship lasted, but otherwise it's more non-specific frustration. I was the last thing to go right for you is just a lyric I liked, and isn't actually about how she's doing. Hopefully she's doing well and is just fine without a relationship. This is one idea I had had a piece of for a few years, and this is the first proof of concept I recorded in 2015.
Can she come over? I haven't had a friend in 2 days. When you were over, my neighbor's house walked away.
Simple stuff, but a lot of the album was born out of those small, simple ideas. Next, Misery is a Riot. This was one of my attempts at a longer track with multiple individual sections going from soft to loud to soft. It took me a while to start putting it together until I heard Get Ready for Love by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. It has that same 1-2-1-2 drum beat and energy, which helped put the whole track into focus. The chorus guitar riff is inspired by the riff from Hold Me, Thrill Me, Kiss Me, Kill Me by U2, but I made sure to rework it so I didn't just lift it wholesale. Again. Lyrically, it's about buried secrets and old lies again, after they both died after the events of the song Cuero, and people are mourning buried secrets, but nobody misses old lies, and the old conservatives didn't bother showing up to pay their respects to either of them. There are lines To the Left of Me and On the Other Side, which reference that liberal-conservative divide. So this is a piece from a proof of concept which I did publicly release.
You gathered around 2 holes, filled by 2 halves. One that we barely met, one we wish we didn't know. It's not what I'd call a crowd, but an outpouring. And I can't help but notice the types that bothered to show. To the left of me, a weeping grafted family tree. To the other side there's nothing to see. Not that I don't know what their words would be. Misery is a riot, misery is a riot.
Next, Single Moving Star, one of the oldest ideas I had for the album. One of the guitar melodies was actually another thing I heard in a dream, back in 2012 in fact, and I made sure to record it when I woke up. I started writing the full song in 2014, and I had the lyrics done by the time I did the demo in 2016. The riff was inspired loosely by Devo. You already heard the demo, so here's a piece from the full song.
Shuttle in the air, here no single moving star. Fly out from the east, here we head the other way. Do I know you on the inside? Maybe I will.
Next song is Neuropia, the second song to be fully recorded, even though it was one of the later ones I started. It's a combination of a whole grab bag of loose lyrics and different ideas I had. One of a song called Do the Neurotic, about the different tics that I have, like I'll close my fist when a car passes by or drum with my teeth when I listen to music. I had a Talking Heads inspired idea that I put down in early 2017. The noise and spoken word bookends are taken from a scrapped intro idea I had for the Spider compilation.
You know, at some point, we've probably all thought the same thing. Let's think about it now. Can you hear it now? That desire for satisfaction? That itching worry you've wasted your money? I guess we weren't thinking the same thing, but I'm happy what's yours is mine.
Pretty pretentious. I'm glad I didn't keep it. The chorus of All These Have to Let Me In, Let's Kill 'Em is something I heard when I played one of my other songs backwards. I don't remember which. The verses are mostly surrealism, but they're inspired by a lot of things I've seen while out on walks around my neighborhood. Like one time someone just left their front door wide open and no one was around. The drums were lifted from Breathe Deep by Cabaret Voltaire. Again, I'd meant to rework them more, but I just ended up lifting them wholesale. The title is a loose reference to Zooropa by U2. I'd been listening to a lot of 90s U2 at the time, and Zooropa is a reference to Europa. And of course, I made sure to put in the face down walls like I made sure to put in the face down walls lick one more time. So here's a clip from the full song.
Sounds like the thought, the skull of a skeleton, being used as a stool. Someone out there thinks he's multiple gods at once. There was a thunderstorm the day you were born, and it missed you by a mile. Your house so often flooded, it moved on its own for several yards.
Next track is My Hyde. This was my attempt to use the tired metaphor of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in a different way. In this case, to describe how depression works to people who don't seem to understand it. Every time a celebrity with depression or manic depression commits suicide, there's always some cock calling their death cowardice. They don't understand that depression is a chronic disease. It's not a common cold. It's a cancer of your consciousness lying to you about being unwanted and worthless and disposable. You can beat it for a time, but you're only in remission. It can come back. The people who lived with it as long as they did were struggling with it right up until they couldn't anymore. So that's who My Hyde is in this case, a talkative method killer, who hasn't killed yet, only because his one victim is still living with the struggle. I also took a shot at said cocks who think depression is something you can just stop. You're only making it worse for everybody. Musically, it's a straight-ahead punk track. The only big idea I had was that the intro would double in speed until it reached the main song's tempo, kind of like what I did with Hang On I Got This. I also added a lot of feedback to the second and third verses because I wanted to amp up the intensity as the song went on. I didn't have any real work tapes for this one, so here's a clip from the full track.
My Hyde is not yet a murderer, still working on first victim. My Hyde is a talkative method killer, who won't tell me how we fix him. My Hyde uses my voice, my Hyde uses my eyes. My Hyde will take you out with decades of his life. A potion in my head brought him out. A potion in my hand made him louder. Cut off my Hyde. He's making way too much noise. He's taking up too much.
Next track is You'll Never Be a Man. We're now firmly in the punk catharsis section of the album. This is a heavy death rock track. Lils described it as sounding a lot like the band Christian Death, which I personally don't hear. Lyrically, it's about policing masculinity, specifically of a transgender man struggling with being accepted, but also more broadly about bullshit standards of masculinity and the struggles of trans people in an unaccepting culture, like fetishization and dehumanization, the fucking Trump administration's ban of trans people in the military, etc. The title comes from the Elvis Costello song of the same name, which for a time I considered covering in a "the cover changes the meaning" way, but its chorus has the line, "You'll never be a man when you're half a woman and you're half awake," which is absolutely not what I want to say, so I canned that idea. The music is built on a bass riff I wrote back in 2013 on a jazz bass my dad had that's been long gone. It's a shame because the riff sounded great on it. Then while recording the album, I came up with the walking echoed guitar. And the background noise is based on a piece of generated feedback I'd made all the way back in July 2010. It's a piece I called Buzzy Screamy. You can just barely hear the original recording that was made out of. It was the bass from the failed attempt to cover White Light, White Heat that I used back in the Flint Robots' It Comes Screaming Back. Next track is pure punk millennial catharsis, principal shit, parentheses, anthem for the tired generation. This is basically the kind of venomous rage that I'd wanted to hear since the 2016 election, but just never did, so I made it myself. It's especially inspired by Jeff Rosenstock and Superchunk, who all had albums that year that made it to my top 20. The title, Principal Shit, comes from a memorial I read for the late Marky Smith of The Fall, where other musicians remembered him, a lot of whom had stories about what a lovable asshat he was. One of them mentioned a time where Mark was lamenting how kids these days have no principles, which is the kind of old fuck whinging you hear all the time, and it always seems to come from people whose principles aren't worth shit. So the song is just railing against baby boomers, Republicans, alt-righters, everyone who has fucked and is fucking the millennials and Generation Z. I coined our collective generations as the tired generation, after noticing how absolutely everyone is exhausted all the time. I saw one image macro of Kurt Russell in The Thing saying, "Nobody trusts anybody now, and we're all very tired," and the caption was mood. There were several songs in 2018 about being There were several songs in 2018 about being tired, namely "Tired" by Moaning. It's mentioned in one of the Beth's songs. It's the entire feel of Jeff Rosenstock's album Post. So this song is just me releasing all of the pent-up frustration. This is a piece from the Work in Progress instrumental. The snare was the big thing that needed a change. It needed a more driving beat rather than a galloping one. The riff is also based on the riff from the Jesus and Mary Chain song My Little Underground, which I covered for the Cuero compilation. I'll talk about that in a bit. And the lead guitar is inspired by Wait for the Blackout by The Damned, one of the few times I did change something after I'd initially lifted it wholesale. Next track, As Gods as Demons, one of the last few tracks I started and finished, and another one of the longer, more dynamic tracks. This is the second song with that synth-based melody I played earlier. I wasn't happy with the song it was originally made for. But in October, Big Time Kill put out their first full-length album, Shock and Awe, and the final track, Failed Regeneration, had a slower, building, arpeggiated synth line, kind of similar to the Stranger Things theme. That finally put into focus how I wanted this song to go. So it's inspired variously by them, Year Zero era Nine Inch Nails, and its more glitchy approach to industrial, and Nick Cave. The ramshackle slide guitar is all him, and I directly reference his song "Red Right Hand" in the first line. The song is about gods and demons actively trying to look and act more like each other over time. The phrase "Red Right Hand" comes from Paradise Lost, but it originally referred to God. So to look more like gods, the demons strip their skin. There's a lot of that kind of imagery. Ultimately, the song is about the kind of people who use their religious beliefs as an excuse or even a commandment to commit evil. The people who supposedly speak for holiness act an awful lot like demons. The whooshing sound throughout the track is actually a piece from that synth percussion from Shake, but phased and reverbed. The guitars were actually all flat originally, and I had to pitch shift them a bit to get them right. And the line, "Ever get the feeling you're being cheated," is the famously last thing Johnny Rotten said at a live show before being fired from the Sex Pistols. Here's a clip.
His fed each sack would spill its usual about, while back in his mind the thoughts repeated. Can you possibly think you're in the right? Do they ever get the feeling they're being cheated?
I did also try making an intro song to the album based around that synth riff called Judas in the Garden of Eden. The idea was it would be a sister song, like how Quero calls forward to the phased percussion from Damask is the Face in its intro. That's also why both tracks repeat "I can't think in here, I can't breathe in here." It ended up half-baked, so I left it as an outtake for the Quero compilation. Here's how it sounded, though. Next track, 40206. I played the original idea for this earlier. It started as a hypnotic, psychedelic piece made entirely with my Stratocaster, bass, percussion, and all. For a long time, the song was complete, right up until before mastering started. Then I decided, since it comes right after all of that intensity in the last 4 tracks, it could use a calmer lead-in. So practically at the last minute, I added this cavernous, icy instrumental before it. Lyrically, it's mostly some surreality. The boy with the thorn in his brain is both a cheeky self-reference and a reference to The Boy with the Thorn in His Side by the Smiths. The Head of the Preacher Man is a reference to Bring Me the Head of the Preacher Man by Susie and the Banshees. And I don't remember how I came up with the nonsensical title. It might have been something like a license plate I saw once, but it's also a shout out to Wire, who often have somewhat nonsensical song titles.
Found a place in a hole in the wall. I'm still not sure what I've found.
I don't remember where the relaxation tape sample at the end comes from. I look forward to the copyright claim that gives me that information. Next, Abbott is Death Process, the penultimate song on the album, but one I started far earlier in the album's recording process because I knew going full shoegaze would take some time and experimenting. And again, I was tweaking it right up to mastering. The title is a line from the movie Arrival. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything. I enjoy titling my songs like that. The plucked melody in the opening is a pretty old recording I did that I called Sad Crystal Waves, because the guitar rig setting I used was called something like Crystal Waves. I also put that piece in the Quero compilation. And the song builds from there. It's the first time where I really played around with the track tempo in the project. Before this, I just doubled the tempo by moving the kick and snare closer. I didn't actually change the tempo in the Sonar project, but I did that a lot in the crescendo section for this song. I wanted it to just keep building, and most importantly, stay interesting the whole 8.5 minutes. But for a while, I didn't think the song was actually complete enough for the album, and I intended to leave it off for the Quero compilation. Then I decided to add a keyboard melody flying around the crescendo section, part of it actually the keyboard melody from the song Quero. That pretty much completed the song for me, and boom, it went back on the album. Lyrically, the song is literally about telling my fellow white people not to be racist, be accepting and welcoming of people in color in positions of power, and getting opportunities that usually only we get. Welcome other cultures, other languages. It's a good thing. It makes our government and economy better for everyone. And again, quoting, "Don't be afraid, don't fear the new song." The second verse was inspired by me mishearing the lyrics to the Nick Cave song, "I Let Love In." I thought he described love as shriveled and bald, and I liked the idea of love not being the traditionally desired one, but despair is. Also the deep brrr that sounds like a didgeridoo. It's actually a sample of a cello. Anyway, here's a clip from the full song. That's a completely wrong song. One sec. I think I might have forgotten to... luckily, I have it open elsewhere. So here. Here's a piece from the Work in Progress instrumental. You can kind of tell how incomplete it was before that keyboard piece came in. And finally, last track, Last Minute Thought of a Man on Fire. Travis came up with that song title years ago. I wanted to do a Manchester-style track all the way back since 2012. Sawtooth did the drum programming for me in 2012 too, and it took me 6 goddamn years to finally make the song. This song was my white whale, and it was the very last song I wrote and recorded for the album. Lyrically, it's a closer look at Old Lies dying in the desert at the start of Quero. Musically, the drum beat is of course inspired by the Stone Roses' Fool's Gold, but the heavier approach to dance rock is inspired by the Inspiral Carpets album, Revenge of the Goldfish. I love that album, it's highly underrated. It's also got my second ever guitar solo. For whatever reason, I only did them in the dance rock tracks. I did the same thing as Face Down Walls, recording it and feeling it out measure by measure, but I'd originally meant to do a more Steve Howe-ish guitar solo. It just ended up sounding like the Stone Roses. But here's a clip of the song. Damn, I'm proud of that one. And the album closes with Buried Secrets walking off singing The Skeleton is Waiting. So that's my third album, Buried Secrets and Old Lies. I'm pretty happy with it, especially after looking back on the older stuff. One of the things I did to keep myself motivated during recording was to occasionally listen to my old music and compare it with the new material. The huge jump in quality definitely made me feel better about the new songs. That said, I did realize how muffled and lacking in high-end the final master came out, so I plan to remaster it at no extra cost to people who already bought it, or my patrons. I did put out a free compilation, Quero, as promotion for the album in October. Aside from a few full album tracks and demos, I did put a few outtakes on there. I played Judas in the Garden of Eden, but I haven't played a clip from the full version of Tribute to a Better Song, so here's that. I wasn't fully happy with that one, but I figured I could at least finish what I had and put it on the compilation. It's a song about writer's block and how I have a penchant for surreal, nonsensical lyrics. The third outtake is perhaps the one with the most interesting backstory, Fountain Neck. It's primarily a hardcore punk nonsense rant inspired by the Butthole Surfers, and it's the most and hardest I've ever screamed for a song. I wanted it to be a major freak out, and in the process, I wrecked my diaphragm. As soon as I was done singing, my torso seized and pulled in on itself. For 2 weeks straight after that, I could not breathe without holding my arms over my head to keep my lungs open. It felt like one of my ribs had pinched a lung, even though thankfully that didn't happen. But it meant I couldn't leave the house for those 2 weeks. I couldn't lie on my back because it would shut my lungs. I couldn't lie on my left side because that's where the pain was worst. I had to sleep for 2 straight months on my right side with my left arm up over my head or on my stomach, which I can't do anyway because it makes my arm fall asleep. I didn't fully heal for 2 months, and people who saw the Sonic Adventure DX and the Zelda Minish Cap Let's Plays might have been aware I was injured for a time. Thankfully, I'm back to 100%, but that was a rough couple months. I learned my limits that day. So here's a clip of Fountain Neck, a song that I knew would be an outtake, but I still kicked my own ass to get it right anyway. I sure knew who was responsible after that. You can just barely hear me. You could just barely hear me at the end going, no. Couple other notes about the compilation. I did covers of Lively Arts by The Damned and My Little Underground by the Jesus and Mary Chain. The former because it's one of the few Damned tracks. I felt in any way confident in covering. The latter because it's one of my favorite songs, period. I also found a remix Sawtooth did of the song Hark the Herald from Black Hole Whitespace that frankly sounded a lot better than the original, and I had meant to do something with it since 2011, but just never did. So I put it here. And Sawtooth also did a new remix of The Mask is the Face that they described as Killing Joke with Harsh Noise. It's a pretty sweet remix. Play that at your next rave, why don't you? Fun note about that track, it originally had a really low dynamic range at DR5, but my mastering boosted it all the way to DR10. That alone actually gave me the confidence to master Buried Secrets myself. Up until then, I was considering sending it off to someone else for mastering. So, that was the Buried Secrets period, which lasted the latter half of 2018. After the album came out, I was sure I'd take a break before I recorded a whole new album. And I did, but only a month. When January 2019 rolled around, some of my musician friends started talking about the RPM Challenge, or Record Production Month Challenge, where you record a whole album in February. As soon as I heard of it, I thought, damn it, I just spent half the year on an album, and yet I kind of want to do this anyway. I thought about what sound I would aim for. I had a few different ideas, but ultimately I settled on more experimentation, leaning more on the shoegaze influences, and more inspiration from progressive rock, especially Yes. I'd been addicted to them since at least 2016, and I was listening to their jazz fusion album Relayer a lot at the time. I also had a few more experimental and abstract ideas left over from Buried Secrets, and even further before it, as well as the whole songs Cancerous Winter and Competition for a Bad Life. I had planned for them to be on Buried Secrets, but I decided I'd rather finish the album in time for December than to try and shoehorn them in. I also went with a more concrete concept for the album, one inspired by the plot of the Ni no Kuni games, but also my lifelong love of video games and how I've always been involved in fan projects that took on lives of their own, like Sergeant Frog Abridged or Zelda Book of the Traitor. The concept is of a person breaking through dimensions to an empty one that they're able to form into their own personal fantasy, and in their case, it's a copy-paste of elements from all their favorite fantasy games, including Zelda, Ni no Kuni, and Dark Souls. Originally, the world builder character was male. Then, like halfway through the month, I decided I could make them a woman, and I wouldn't have to change anything. If anything, it gave it more subtext. Shortly before February began, my dad mentioned that he'd bought an acoustic electric baritone guitar, but was never using it. I've been interested in baritones for a while, so I swiped it from him, and I ended up using it almost the entire album. Its tuning is technically in standard, just a string lower, but that different sonic flavor and the fact that I hadn't recorded with an acoustic since my second album was very inspiring. On February 1st, I recorded 2 acoustic demos with it that I sent to Jacob, both of which he liked a lot. The first was a semi-improvised jam for Micronova. It was only semi-improvised because I hadn't nailed down the chord structure or even started writing lyrics, and you can kind of tell when you hear it. The second demo, which ended up being very like the final track, was for The Shift Key is Broken and So Is My Heart. I thought up the title while out on a walk. It's a goof at musicians like my friend Patrick and his project Smell that title everything entirely in lowercase. The song was also meant to be a spoof, but it ended up mostly serious. After that, I focused on recording the complete songs. First was the opener, Micronova.
But the lonely girl can't tell she's not where she was. The micronova's called you out. But the nova's to bring it back. More to wonder, more to fight. The micronova say goodbye. That your mind is all that you will see.
Micronova was partially inspired by Autodidact by Swerve Driver, though more how I remembered the song than how the song actually is. I remembered Swerve Driver Swerve Driver being more shoegazy than they actually are. They have touches, but they're more dreamy alternative rock. But that incomplete memory gave the idea for Micronova. You can kind of tell it was inspired by Autodidact just by the rhythm of the word. Autodidact, Micronova. The title's a play on supernovas, but I looked it up and there's not really a phenomenon called a micronova. There are several different companies called it. So I went with whatever phenomenon that happened to the girl to make her break through dimensions would be the micronova, and it would also be what gave her the power to build her new world. It's an impartial power. Her loves and all the baggage she's bringing from our world will both end up in her new world. Regarding the sound of the track, when I was deciding what genres the album would fit under, Micronova and some of the following dreamier tracks didn't quite fit under shoegaze in my mind. They're heavily influenced by it, but they're more legible and more rockist in structure, so I decided to partially call the album dream rock. Dream rock's not a definitive genre like dream pop, but there are a few bands who've been called it, like Flaming Lips. My idea is it's like dream pop and shoegaze, but it leans more towards a rock structure and isn't as obscured. The second complete song I recorded was something called College Hermit Blues, about how my usual days went while I was in college. I'd written it for a songwriting class back in college, the same class where I wrote Get Out of the House, and I figured I would never actually record it because I've been long out of college since 2014, and it wasn't an especially serious song to begin with. But with the RPM challenge, I figured why the hell not, though it ended up as a bonus track anyway.
The sun's going down now. Tomorrow is cold. I like a bit of sunlight, but it was getting old. I walk a mile a day. I'm sweating my ass away. I drown in water all I can. But let's be honest, nature, I was just getting back my tan.
Next, I did the complete version of The Shift Key is Broken, since I already knew how I wanted it to sound.
There was one back home who treated me well. Their name escapes me now. There was one back home who listened to me. Their face fell out of my head. I wish sometimes that I was the
I recorded it early, but I knew it would be much later in the album. It went through very few changes. The only thing I added near the end of the album's recording was the fade-in intro. I thought the song started too quickly without it. Lyrically, I started leaning into the idea that the main character had been abused, building up her desire to escape the world, which got amplified by some later tracks. Hey, it's Dingo says, in its place as a bonus track, College Hermit Blues really sounds like the girl begrudgingly getting back into the swing of being back in the real world. I hadn't thought of it that way. My thought was its placement here was like, that's, along with some of the other tracks I'm going to talk about here, that's just what her life was like. At least when she was going through college. But I like that idea, too. We're going to talk a bit about how there's kind of an ambiguous ending to the album, but it's partially because people come up with more interesting things than what would be intended by the author sometimes. Like in situations like that. Because I like that idea. The next song I started recording is up there with Last Minute Thought of a Man on Fire as one of my oldest ideas that I just never got around to actually recording, Electricity. The song started entirely with that vocal synth arpeggio. I recorded that part all the way back in 2011 with a microKORG. It's one of the presets, so I added reverb to make it sound somewhat different. The song had quite a life before I finally finished it here. For a long time, I wanted it to be a collaboration between me and Sawtooth, with them doing an Aphex Twin drum pattern, but that never happened. Then for a while, I planned to make the song about something Tiana said. She'd mentioned that her body felt like it was being jolted with electricity when the weather changes, and that's where the title and the line, "The weather brings electricity," came from. But I didn't finally finish the song until here, at which point it became a more abstract representation of the world builder's euphoria. She's at her joyous peak, so you know things are going to go downhill. Structurally, this is the first song I did that changes time signature at different points, but that's only because my use of the microKORG's arpeggiator was a bit inexact. I had to clean and tighten up the recording before I could make a song that stayed on beat. Next, I got around to recording Competition for a Bad Life and Cancerous Winter. Because they were originally planned for Buried Secrets, their lyrical conceits still follow that idea of lies and oppression, but Competition would have stood out hard on that album due to being in 7/4 time.
But you need a tragedy to befall you before you're welcomed in the pain queue. We're not running a competition for a bad life. The future didn't last long, did it? My education took its precious time. You treat me like I'm a special case.
I've had that bass line sitting around since 2011, and that whistling noise in the background since 2010. It's another piece of generated feedback. Now, I never finished the lyrics back when it was planned for Buried Secrets, so for World Builder, I made them explicitly from her point of view. This is the frustrating situation she's in. She couldn't finish college, her games are the only things she can be bothered with anymore, and her anger is building. The original conceit for the song, and where its chorus comes from, is how on the internet we're often comparing our suffering against each other. Like you're not allowed to feel bad about your depression because you're not starving in Africa, that kind of thing. The title and the idea especially came from something my friend John Pino either said or reblogged, outright saying that suffering is not a competition. You're allowed to feel your own pain. The next song, Cancerous Winter, also has more to do with Buried Secrets concept, but its inclusion does add some subtext I hadn't originally meant.
About now that the word comes in, we'd have another permanent blackout. No one was ready for the cancerous winter. No heroes anymore.
It's an indie guitar pop song, inspired a lot by the work of Johnny Marr, and it was one of the first of many times on this album that I made a conscious effort to do a good guitar solo. I almost never did them until now, because I can't write or perform them for longer than a measure at a time, but I'm very happy with how they all came out. I originally had the idea for the song back in 2016, when several beloved celebrities died in that winter from cancer, one after the other, chiefly David Bowie and Alan Rickman. Of course, the years continued, and more beloved celebrities died, but also a different kind of celebrity death started happening, the death of admiration and respect. Many celebrities were outed for abuse and assault of many different kinds, in a scope that hadn't occurred before. And that's where the unintentional bit of subtext turns up. Perhaps part of why the world builder is so broken down is because she falls victim to someone she respected, and they end up as one of the villains at the end of the album. Next track I recorded was also the next on the album, A Different Place in the Twilight. Even though it's one of the softer acoustic tracks, it's actually the point where the girl has her breaking point and puts her fist through her monitor, at which point the micronova occurs. The title is a play on the various places called Twilight Blank, like the Twilight Zone or the Twilight Realm from Zelda Twilight Princess. Fun note about the mastering for this song, because of the effects I put on my vocals, there's a lot of sub-bass you don't hear, and in mastering they got amplified so much that my vocals volume hit flat 0. It actually gave the song the most dynamic range I ever had, DR16, but I tempered those low frequencies a lot because that was extreme. You can't even really tell listening to it, but that's why you ride by your instruments. Next track is Self-Portrait with Stolen Painting, my first real foray into spoken word. This song got juggled around a lot. The title and spoken word lyrics were originally for something much jazzier and inspired by Yes's Relayer. I forgot what that song was going to be called. I forget what this song was going to be called, but as the end of February loomed in the distance, I consolidated the completed industrial post-punk instrumental with the spoken story. This instrumental, as much as anything, makes me want to release the instrumental versions of the whole album separately. So here's the instrumental. Hey, it's Dingo also mentions Cancerous Winter brings to mind the January 2019 flash freezing in the central USA, so that's forever connected to me. It just encapsulates all the shit 2019 has been. And it's been shit since 2016. Just fails to improve enough. So, for Self-Portrait with Stolen Painting, I'm using a lot of effects from Guitar Rig in there for pretty much everything, and the bass line is modified from a slower idea I had that was more suited to some like left-field hip-hop than post-punk. The spoken word story is simply of the girl discovering the empty dimension and filling it with things from her favorite games. I directly reference Clocktown from Zelda Majora's Mask and Ding Dong Dell from Ni no Kuni. The Cathedral in the Mountains is a reference to the Nexus from Demon's Souls, but it could easily be about any of the other cathedrals from the Dark Souls games. Next, my first real multi-part, multi-time signature progressive rock epic, Tell Me About Your Planet. I worked on it bit by bit for a while, but this point of recording is about when I started solidifying it. Earlier at the start of January, I put down a jazzy idea that eventually became the section Look No Forget, and prepare yourselves for some weak beatboxing. The complete song starts with the Tell Me About Your Planet intro, which is a continuation of motifs from A Different Place in the Twilight and Micronova. The title was inspired by the title to the Utopia album, Oops, Wrong Planet, and I referenced Katamari Damacy with the line, Did you roll it up by hand? The point where I knew the whole multi-part song would work was when I got to the transition from the intro to Look No Forget. I still love how this bit came out. You can kind of tell I'm using a distorted acoustic electric for the whole thing. There's an airiness and buzziness to the guitar. I like how it sounds, but it did take a lot of EQing and multiband compression to keep it from drowning itself out. Look No Forget transitions into an instrumental piece that I originally thought up after a weird dream. A person on stage was singing a lovely song gently, word by word. Beauty, empathy, shark. And I literally woke up right then laughing. It was such an amazing swerve that I had to make a song like that. My first idea was much more erratic and kind of atonal. This is a scratch recording I sent to Jacob. Shark. 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 The final piece is much more tuneful, but no less improvised and chaotic. This is me really flexing my multiple time signature muscles, and also my Steve Howe influence on guitar.
Shark. Shark.
I kind of accidentally found a couple shark leitmotifs while putting that whole solo together, so I kept reusing them. I'm not anywhere near as dexterous as Steve Howe, so I at least like to do those pull-offs where you pull a string with your fretting finger so that it plays loud like you plucked it, but you don't get that attack you would get from a pick. To wit, Shark continues on into a softer guitar solo. Those lower notes are me realizing, oh yeah, it's a baritone guitar. I should actually use the A string at some point. But the solo then transitions into the final part of the song, The Human Conditioner. That's a title I had meant for a more complete song in its own right, so I think I'm going to recycle it for later use. But here, it's a more soft bossa nova piece inspired by the early work of Everything But the Girl. I'd recently listened to their first album, Eden, and it's fantastic. If I never knew what to put as lyrics, just refer back to the Micronova. Never failed. The overall song is basically the world builder comparing her new world to the old and starting to build an ego. I like to imagine Shark is just her being distracted suddenly by a shark. While I was working on Tell Me About Your Planet, around the point where I started recording Look No Forget, I was thinking that the album could use a rocking album closer to go out on a high note. One mentally productive shower later, I had planned out an entire song that became the title track, World Builder. While I was solidifying the idea, I at least recorded a guitar and organ idea. It's a cheap Yamaha keyboard, but if you put effects on it, it can sound pretty good. I used its synth setting back on Here Comes Singularity Black. Like how Tell Me About Your Planet reuses motifs from Micronova, the lead guitar in World Builder is expanded from the lead guitar in the bridge in Micronova. The track came out kind of classic rock. But of course, I'm trying on some prog and jazz influences, so I had to work in an improvised guitar and organ freakout. I say improvised. I improvised it a couple times until I had some half-decent ideas. Then I worked them out into something that actually sounded good. That clanging was a bum note, but I loved how it sounded distorted, so I kept it in and reused it a couple more times. The solo is overall a bit silly, but I enjoyed doing it. And to close out the track, a good old punk rock blast, transitioning to one last soft acoustic instrumental. I'd intended World Builder to be a thematic conclusion to the album, in the way that bookends Micronova and how it's more conceptual and less of a specific point in the story. I don't think that quite works out, if only because I still had lyrics to write for the rest of the songs, and I hadn't decided where the story would go. The album ends up open-ended as far as what happens to the world builder, but the idea is she has some rethinking to do about her supposedly perfect world. She's had the wind taken out of her sails. To wit, Hey It's Dingo says, part of what made College Hermit feel like it did to me is World Builder has a feeling of the character of the World Builder being violently ripped back into the real world. Especially the opening line made that fit to me. I can see that. Part of why I like leaving it so ambiguous is people can read different things into it. So that's the thought. I was thinking more that like she's still in her world, but she has to sit down and think about it a little more. Just plopping her favorite things in it didn't quite work out as she'd hoped. But she'd had the wind taken out of her sails by the events of the album's 8th track, Northern Mantra. That was one of my favorite tricks for this album. That 1-2 cymbal crashes. I did that in Micronova too. Northern Mantra is me stretching again, this time into punky heavy metal, inspired at least a bit by Judas Priest. It seemed appropriate for what's effectively the world builder's demons from her world, the people who abused her, invading her perfect world in place of video game villains. The attack occurs in the section Colony Collapse. The third and final section of the song is We're Not All Here, where the world builder faces the man who abused her the most. I never say who exactly it is, but it was clearly someone she lived with who was trying to manipulate her, get her to give up and come home by both applauding her work and dismissing it, insulting and belittling her, all the abuser tactics. She responds by splitting his skull in half with a sword. Just making sure I actually did have a clip. The guitar riff was originally inspired by the Cars. Actually, it's more of a new wave riff, but I metaled it up for this.
The first words he said made her body freeze. It's been a while. Can we go home, please? We've done well, but now you'll break us down. We're not all here, so ruin all your fun. There's some back home who couldn't come along. We're not all here, there's more where you belong.
So that's track 8. Track 9 is The Shift Key is Broken, which is her setting down and taking stock, reflecting on the misery that led her here in the first place, and wondering what she's going to do now. The album's open-ended, if only because the RPM challenge is for 10 songs and I had to wrap it up at some point. But I probably would have ended ambiguously anyway. For an album recorded entirely in a month, it's a good comparison to my first album, Black Hole Whitespace, also recorded in a month, and a dramatic difference in quality. Recording World Builder was a great exercise in many different ways, from production techniques to song styles, to simply forcing myself to speed up the process to very little loss of quality. There's not much, if anything, I would go back and fix, and in some ways I think it came out even better than Buried Secrets and Old Lies. Part of why I'm going back and remastering the latter soon. While that was the album, just before I finished recording Northern Mantra, my My friend Patrick invited me to feature on a song for his Project Smells album, Viva Lasagna, which was also being recorded at the time for the RPM challenge. He sent me a bare instrumental with piano and drums, and the only ideas he had for it was that it was called Bird Ghosts, and that it was really depressing. It would be perfect for you, he said. I immediately thought up the idea of a person letting another fall to their death. Patrick liked the idea, so I wrote lyrics, sang, and played guitar and EBow for the song in the process of just one evening. I did the lyrics by just vocalizing at first, and then I wrote lyrics based on what I heard. You can hear the final version on Viva Lasagna at smellma.bandcamp.com, with the addition of Patrick's fantastic harmony vocals. But I want to play the proof of concept that I sent him. I'm thinking of asking him if I can release my own mix of the track that's more like this. Actually, I should clarify, this is the entire thing. It's 4 minutes. And I did realize sometime after Scott Walker passed away that I was definitely channeling him for this. Hey, it's Dingo says, I immediately can tell you still had World Builder on your mind with that guitar riff. Yep. It was right near the end of recording. And it was still kind of doing the Steve Howe thing. Also, before that, you said author versus listener interpretation is strong in World Builder. Yeah. Well, like I said, part of the album was partially inspired by all the fan projects I'd done. And you know, when you leave things open-ended, your viewers are going to come up with their own ideas. And oftentimes, what your fans think up is a better explanation than anything you could have thought up. And even like the title "World Builder," it refers to world building when you're writing a story. And like with the Book of the Traitor comic, there is a lot of world building that had to go into the backstory for that. Like, what is New Ordon like? What's the government? What are people like? So it all kind of ties into it. And so that's also why I encourage listeners to kind of come up with their own conclusions about it, leaving it open-ended, because what you all could have like even you, Dingo, what you've come up with is more interesting than what I would have come up with. But that's all of my musical output as of today. I'm feeling confident about recording more down the line now that I know my major hang-ups about starting recording and putting down drums are unfounded. I'm also looking forward to updating the old material later in the year for what's going to be called the Forgotten Ones, parentheses, the 2019 mixes. And some of those old songs still hold up, but there's plenty that could stand a facelift. Before we call this a podcast, any more questions or comments? Took the bird ghosts as a chance for a little break. Shark! It's Dingo adds, like how Mark Hoppus says Even If She Falls is a happy end to Blink-182's reunion album, Neighborhoods, even though that is a thoroughly depressing song. Yeah. The World Builder is a great album either way. Great work. Thank you. I'm very proud of it. Especially since I did it in under a month. And especially since I did it in a month. And that was Patrick's second album he did for RPM. Smell's first album, Woof, he also did for RPM. But you could definitely tell he's making much more of an effort to do complete songs this time. I highly recommend both Smell albums. Like I mentioned, Woof was highly inspirational for me getting back into recording music. Even though if you listen to it, you're probably not gonna hear a lot of direct influence in Buried Secrets. It was more of the attitude. But also, apparently, Patrick was in turn listening to Buried Secrets and Old Lies while he was working on Viva Lasagna for ideas. It was one of several albums he was listening to, but it's really cool that, like, we're inspiring each other now. I can probably just grab a link and it will be here in the TheStrawhatNO livestream version. Smellma.bandcamp.com. I mean, there's also a live version. There's also a live album, live at WMFO. It's basically just Woof recorded live on radio. Like, you get both. Both Woof and the live album are free, and Viva Lasagna is just $1, so... For $1, you could get 2 complete albums, and one of the albums recorded live again. Inspiration and influence are as connected as they are separate. Oh yeah, definitely. Some of my absolute most favorite bands and artists, I don't sound that much like. I don't really sound like They Might Be Giants or Elvis Costello. I'm starting to sound a little more like Chrome, but... Wow, at worst, like, I get dust on my guitar. Were you, like, stashing it in the attic or something? Alright. I'm gonna call it here. Thank you all for listening. No solid plans for what the next episode will be about. I'm leaning towards talking about either Zelda or Scott Walker. But for now, thank you for humoring my little tour through memory lane. I'm Austin Scholl, and I've been a thorn in your brain.